Welcome to Why Reconstruction Matters, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ann Thornton, Vice Provost and University Librarian at Columbia. The libraries are delighted to co-host this evening's program with the World Leaders Forum. We are pleased to have co-sponsorship by the Columbia Department of History and the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panelists. Kimberly Crenshaw is Isidor and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. Professor Crenshaw co-founded and is the Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum, focusing on elimination of structural inequality. She coined the term intersectionality to describe how race, class, and gender intersect with and overlap each other. Professor Crenshaw hosts a dynamic podcast, Intersectionality Matters. She is a leading scholar of critical race theory, which transformed how law, race, and racial power are understood. She co-directed a pivotal work in the field, Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings that Formed the Movement. Professor Crenshaw is widely known for generating the hashtag #SayHerName campaign. Eric Foner is DeWitt Clinton Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University's Department of History. Professor Foner is one of America's most prominent historians. His work on the Civil War and Reconstruction, slavery, and 19th century America has won many awards, including a Pulitzer Prize and 2 Bancroft Prizes. No modern historian has done more to affirm the centrality of the Reconstruction era to the American political story and to center it in contemporary dialogue. His latest book, The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution, focuses on the battles over the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Henry Louis Gates Jr. is Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Professor Gates is a scholar, journalist, and Emmy award-winning filmmaker. He has created more than 15 documentary series, including the PBS series, Finding Your Roots. He recently collaborated with our other panelists on the PBS documentary series, Reconstruction, America After the Civil War. His most recent book is Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. And the moderator for our panel is Lee C. Bollinger, the 19th president of Columbia University. President Bollinger is the first Seth Low professor of the university, a member of the faculty of Columbia Law School, as well as an alumnus, and one of the nation's foremost First Amendment scholars. As many of you know, before coming to Columbia, President Bollinger led the University of Michigan's landmark Supreme Court case upholding the importance of diversity as a compelling justification for affirmative action in higher education. He has been honored with the National Conference for Community and Justice's Humanitarian Award, as well as the National Equal Justice Award from the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, among a great many other honors. To frame tonight's discussion, we will view a brief video excerpt from the PBS documentary, Reconstruction, America After the Civil War. Please be aware that some viewers may find images in the documentary disturbing. Following the video, President Bollinger will launch the discussion with our panelists. And throughout the panel, please feel free to use the Q&A icon in the webinar to submit your questions, which panelists will address in the final segment of tonight's program.
Let us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s, but less is known about what came afterward, the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction.
Did you ever study Reconstruction in school?
No.
A paragraph or two. We never really studied it.
I didn't learn anything about Reconstruction.
Reconstruction was our shining moment. It's the second founding of our country.
Overnight, people who have been defined as property take leadership positions in the South. So this is an incredibly heady moment, kind of like Barack Obama becoming president. But those black folks had no idea of the cliff they were heading towards.
Reconstruction produced a violent backlash, a racist backlash.
I want us to tell the truth about our history, not to punish America. I want to liberate us, but we can't get to liberation if we don't acknowledge what we've done.
It's our town now!
Do you believe that we as a nation are still undergoing the process of Reconstruction?
You might almost say it never ended. We are still trying to come to terms with the consequences of the end of slavery in this country.
This is a chapter of our history that's been misrepresented and misunderstood. It's time that we acknowledge the true story and complete the work of reconstructing America.
All right, shall we begin? We need Kim and Eric on video. There we go. So Eric, Kim, and Skip, dear friends and colleagues, it's a great honor for me to be with you this evening. And there are three general areas I would love us to cover in the period we have 50 minutes or so for discussion. One is, what attracted you to think about and understand Reconstruction and to communicate about it? The second is, what is the relationship of the Reconstruction era and the surrounding eras to today's world that we're in? And the third is, what do we do from here? What can we expect and what do we need to do? So I hope we can get into those subjects, but let's begin with Skip and the question, Skip, why did you do this series? What was behind your thinking?
Thank you, Lee. It's so kind of you to, I know how busy you are, brother, to host this event. It's good to see you again and to be here with my good friends and co-conspirators, Eric and Kim. Reconstruction, in a nutshell, was 12 years of Black freedom, followed by an alt-right rollback. Does that sound familiar? 8 years of Black freedom under Obama, followed by an alt-right rollback. I remember when Barack was elected, there were actually people writing books about the end of race. It seems like something of a joke now, the end of race and racism. Andy Young told me when I filmed him for this series that our people had become drunk on freedom or hypnotized, that they had lost their way. Think about what Reconstruction is. It's a pivotal moment in American history. The Constitution was rewritten to establish birthright citizenship, equality before the law regardless of race, and the right to vote for Black men. Yet the period is little known and for decades was widely misunderstood. As that sequence of interviews shows, for people our age, it wasn't even taught. And I wanted to make this intervention to make sure that that we had a popular medium so it could be used in schools. Reconstruction was the first attempt to establish an interracial democracy in this country. And the issues central to Reconstruction, citizenship, who gets to be an American, voting rights, voter suppression, terrorist violence, the relationship between economic and political democracy. Sound familiar? They continue to roil our society and politics today, making the understanding of Reconstruction even more vital. And my final point is that Reconstruction, just like the election of Barack Obama, inspired a violent racist reaction, which led, with the approval of a conservative Supreme Court, to the imposition of the Jim Crow system, only overturned in the Civil Rights era, sometimes called the Second Reconstruction. So one takeaway, if you ask me, what do I want students and teachers and the general audience to take away, there would be two things: the power of voter suppression and the fact that achievement and rights thought permanent can be overturned, and our rights can never be taken for granted, which is why we have to vote, we have to vote, we have to vote.
Thank you, Skip, very much. Kim, let's go to you.
Well, let me start first of all by saying it's a great honor to be back together with the Reconstruction posse, as it were, and such a delight to see you as well, Lee. So I'm going to say what he said, right? What Skip said. With a little bit of reflection, I guess, starting from a relative contemporary moment and going backwards. Reconstruction was of interest to me, of course, as a law professor and someone who taught civil rights. But the more popular understanding of Reconstruction, I think, serves the purpose of reclaiming a particular dimension of Martin Luther King's March on Washington speech. It always gets celebrated in terms of his invocation of color blindness, but for the most part, his speech was about the demand to cash a check that had come back marked insufficient funds. Well, what was that check? When was it written? Who wrote it? And who stole the money? That's what Reconstruction is all about. It is the story of what almost happened, what could have been the settlement after the end of slavery. The end of slavery was the beginning of what? Well, Reconstruction was an effort to say what the beginning of that what was. And in its broadest, most aspirational dimension, Reconstruction was the moment when our framers, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, really tried to reverse Dred Scott, not just Dred Scott's argument that Black people could never be citizens. That's the smaller part. The bigger part was Dred Scott's argument that the status of enslavability, the fact that Black people could be enslaved, was a permanent marker of their impossibility of ever being citizens, ever being treated equal. And that included both people who were enslaved and Black people who were not enslaved. So this connection between enslavement and Blackness was forged at the beginning of our republic. And so Reconstruction can be thought about as trying to disentangle that notion of Black inferiority as a justification for slavery. So if we're going to repudiate slavery, then it should mean that we're repudiating all the ways that Black inferiority was written across the legal terrain, the social terrain as well. And so Reconstruction was that possibility. If we don't know the story of Reconstruction, then it means that our received understanding of racial inequality, where Black people are in society, is the product of deficient people, not deficient institutions. The product of people who are missing, who are lacking, rather than people who never got that check that Martin Luther King talked about. So for me, Reconstruction tells us everything we need to know about what the possibilities were, because there were real possibilities of reaching across the race divide, of building what many of our class forward critics like to say. We need to have cross-class collaborations, cross-race collaborations. Well, they happened. They were just destroyed. So I see Reconstruction as Skip pointed out, a cautionary tale. We got that far, and not only was all of that taken away, we got pushed back even further. Backlash is I won't use the word today, but backlash is a terrible, terrible thing. And it can push us further back than we can possibly imagine. So that's one of the reasons why I think Reconstruction is the must-tell story of this moment.
Thanks very much, Kim. Eric?
Yeah, well, again, I want to thank Columbia, President Bollinger, and my two friends here for taking part in this discussion. I've devoted a lot of my scholarly career to studying Reconstruction, writing about it. But as the little clip on the video showed, I'm fully aware that many people know very little about it. or what they do know, quote unquote, is distorted or just plain wrong. Another reason why Reconstruction is important to understand is that it's an illustration of what you might call the politics of history. That is how historical interpretation both reflects and in fact shapes the present that the historian is living in. I'm not going to go into a long disquisition on historiography. That's enough to get off. But the fact is that for 3/4 of a century, the dominant view of Reconstruction was, and which originated in a scholarly form here in Columbia, in the so-called Dunning School, was that it was a terrible mistake. Reconstruction was a disaster. It was a period of corruption, misgovernment, a travesty of democracy. Why? Because of the terrible mistake of giving Black men the right to vote. That the failure of Reconstruction demonstrated not, as Kim was just saying, that there was a violent backlash, but that Black people are just incapable of taking part intelligently in American democracy. And this view was circulated in the scholarly world, in movies, Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, and others, in popular novels and other forms. And the underlying message was not just something about history. It was that the white South was justified in taking away these rights around the turn of the century when the Jim Crow system was fully put in place. And that if you actually gave African Americans back the rights that were supposedly guaranteed in the Constitution, you'd have another replay of the so-called horrors of Reconstruction. Long into the 20th century, as Gunnar Myrdal pointed this out in An American Dilemma in 1944, when pressed on the question of racial justice, large numbers of white Southerners would just say, well, that's just going to produce another Reconstruction. The so-called horrors of Reconstruction were part of the legitimation of the Jim Crow South. So to understand the real Reconstruction, that is to what actually happened, which was indeed inspiring to me, despite its unhappy ending, if you understand the achievements that were made in Reconstruction, the interracial democracy that was created, the rise of the Black church and other institutions of the Black community, then that whole argument for Black incapacity, which comes out of the idea of the old idea of Reconstruction, that whole argument falls to the ground if you have an accurate, up-to-date view of the Reconstruction era.
And Eric, we in the world are incredibly indebted to you for having made that revelation apparent in 1988, no less. So you
know what? Excuse me, Lee. The one thing I didn't get to say was when I decided to do the film on Reconstruction, I knew that I had to have one person agree to be the principal historical consultant. And without him, wasn't going to be no Reconstruction film. And that is the my friend 3 boxes away on my screen. Eric is Mr. Reconstruction. And he's done more, drawing on the revolutionary work of W.E.B. Du Bois in 1935, who wrote Black Reconstruction that year. Eric has done more than anybody to overturn the narrative that was enshrined at Columbia with the Channing School. Now, when you asked me, why did I do this series now? What was the biggest surprise? I had studied Reconstruction at Du Bois's book and Rayford Logan's Betrayal of the Negro when I took a survey course in Afro-American history at Yale, 1969, 1970. And I'd read some of Eric's work. I hadn't studied that biblical tome of his on the history of Reconstruction till I decided to make a film about it. But the biggest surprise to me, and maybe Kim, you knew this already, was the fact that although the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote nationally, Black men in 10 of the 11 former Confederate states got the right to vote in the summer of 1867 because of the Reconstruction Act. And incredibly, 80%, Lee, of the Black men eligible to register to vote, registered to vote. I call it the first freedom summer. And guess what? A year later in 1868, they actually voted. 500,000 Black men cast their ballots in 1868, overwhelmingly for Ulysses S. Grant. Well, Grant won the Electoral College in a landslide, but he only won the popular vote by about, if I'm remembering correctly, 300-some thousand votes. So in effect, Black men could claim that they had elected a president, and they did the same thing in 1872. And in South Carolina, they had a majority of the House of Representatives and Secretary of State and Speaker of the House. And one more surprise, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority Black states. Florida, Georgia, and Alabama were almost majority Black states. This represented the first concentration of the potential of Black power. And in my opinion, this flipped people out. No one had thought that the Black men, who were mostly illiterate, right, because it was illegal to teach Black men and women to read and write, that they would actually respond to the franchise in the way that they did. And I just want to end with this one quote to underscore the power of this fear of the Black vote. And it's from Thomas Dixon's horribly, notoriously racist novel, The Leopard Spots, from 1902. Simply because so long as the Negro is here with a ballot in his hands, he is a menace to civilization. The Republican Party placed him here. The name Republican will stink in the South for a century, not because they beat us in war, but because 2 years after the war, that's the summer of 1867, in profound peace, they inaugurated a second war on the unarmed people of the South. Their attempt to establish with the bayonet an African barbarism on the ruins of Southern society was a conspiracy against human progress. Echoing what Kim said, it was the blackest crime of the 19th century. It was the power, the enormous power of the vote that I think terrified not only people in the South, understandably, white people in the South, but white people in the North too. I think the end of Reconstruction was conspiracy exercised between white people in the North and white people in the South. I don't think there were, by 1890, there were innocents left.
Very powerful, Skip, as always. Kim, let me turn to you. I mean, bring us to the present day. You have been one of the most, if not the most, imaginative in developing so-called critical race theory, but in a way, in my mind, that's a way of almost marginalizing it, the term. It is a way of thinking about everything from free speech to voting to education and so on, that reshapes how we should think about it. And it's been an unbelievably important contribution. So, you know, from the Jim Crow era to the 50s and 60s, which is a kind of echo of the Reconstruction period to today, how do you see all of that? Bring us to the present.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, Lee. You know, when I think about trying to make Reconstruction legible to people who are experiencing this moment, I think, you know, as Skip pointed out, you know, this is backlash politics, and for people to understand the backlash is not exceptional, but part of a historical pattern of some degree of progress and then backlash that pushes us back even further. That same frame with respect to just thinking about politics is also playing out in the law itself. So when we think about the fact that just 12 years after the end of slavery, we had a Supreme Court that basically said that civil rights protections, anti-discrimination protections, were not only unconstitutional, they were effectively preferential treatment. They were reverse discrimination. They were giving something illegitimately to the freedmen, and by that measure, taking something away from white folks. It was the same argument that President Johnson used when he vetoed the Civil Rights Acts of 1866, basically saying anti-discrimination, fair treatment, equality is reverse discrimination. It is giving something that they don't deserve and taking something away from white folks that they have a right to. Now, let's just fast forward that. That's the same kind of argument that was used during the civil rights movement, when white owners of diners and restaurants and movie theaters and other places of public amusement basically said, we are resisting this because this is a violation of our rights. This is taking away something from us. What? The right of supremacy, the right of exclusion. And let's take it up to the more contemporary period, in which anti-racism is now being framed as the new racism. Right? We see it in the executive order that the president recently signed, in which all sorts of social justice, racial equity ideas, the idea that we actually are a society that still is in equity deficit, and we need to be directing our attention to understanding these inequalities to better intervene against them. That whole thing has been framed in the same language that the earlier president, who was a white nationalist, framed it as in terms of this is taking away from our white citizens to give to our Black citizens. So what is, at the end of the day, a lesson of a possibility that Reconstruction could have represented legally? Well, it could have represented a repudiation of that entire baseline, that repudiation of the idea that what were the expected rights and entitlements, the preferences, the privileges of whiteness, was no longer going to be the constitutionalized standard from which to measure what is anti-discrimination versus what is preferential treatment. And there was this possibility, there was this way of thinking about the new national citizenship that was created. There was this way of thinking about, if we're going to repudiate slavery, we need to repudiate the legal infrastructure that made it possible. If we're going to create powers that Congress has, powers that might override states' rights, we should do it in the same spirit that we enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause. That was reaching into the states. It was saying, no, you can't protect your freedmen. You can't protect Black folk because there's a pre-existing right in the Constitution that slaveholders have, and we're going to execute those rights against your traditional rights, states, to protect your citizens. Well, that's what was done in the name of slavery, which Justice Harlan pointed out. Then certainly the embrace of freedom means that those very same powers, now that they're explicit in the Constitution, should be used to change that baseline. I like to tell people to think about this. When Black people ran away when they were slaves, they committed a crime. That crime was theft. They stole themselves. That shows you what a baseline of slavery does to acts of liberation. So if we're repudiating slavery and the baseline, then running away is no longer theft. Running away is freedom. It's self-help. It's actualizing the natural right to be free. So that very possibility could have happened throughout law. And had we had a different Supreme Court, Reconstruction would have lasted longer than a decade and a half. If we'd had different judges with a different orientation, their creativity would have been used to dismantle enslavability rather than to use the 14th Amendment as it did creatively to create rights for corporations, to create a whole infrastructure of things that weren't imagined when freedom was the point of the framers. So I try to get people to see that everything we're dealing with now has a root in the past. There's nothing new under the sun. The only thing that can make the difference now is for people to be aware of it and to commit ourselves not to repeating the horrific story of what happened at the end of Reconstruction.
Unmute, Lee.
You're muted, Mr. President.
That's a standard condition for me. I wanted to say that Kim gave a very powerful educational, I think, mission for all of this, and it's extremely important. So I wanted to give Eric a chance to weigh in on this before we turn to, how do we design the future? If we do have this kind of Reconstruction is, as I think Kim put it, a cautionary tale. And you've used the term backlash and the term of there's a kind of one step forward, two step back sort of nature of all of this. What can we do besides education? We're incredibly important in changing people's lives, but what can we do in the structure of our institutions and society to try to minimize that backlash? But Eric, I want to give you a chance.
Well, Lee and Kim, I'm not a law professor like the two of you are, or a legal scholar, but I play one on TV sometime. But, I do think there are avenues for significant, almost reviving some of the principles of Reconstruction. I mean, let's take the right to vote. Obviously, we're 2 weeks away from the presidential election. Many people don't quite realize that there is no national right to vote in this country. That is no standard definition of who can vote. You can move from one state to another and lose your right to vote if you don't meet some ID requirement or something like that. Even the 15th Amendment, critical as it was in trying to guarantee the right of African-American men to vote, women, of course, were not included by it, was phrased in a negative way. States cannot deny you the right to vote because of race, but it doesn't deny other ways of depriving people of the right to vote. I was thinking about this just last week when I was listening to the Supreme Court, confirmation hearings of Judge Barrett, who claims to be a textualist when it comes to interpreting the law. I don't want to go into all of that, except to say, in 1890, look what textualism, that is viewing the language with no historical context whatsoever, look at what this led to. In 1890, Mississippi held a constitutional convention whose purpose was, as all the delegates said, to deny Black men the right to vote. They said explicitly, we are here to take the vote away from Black men. That's what we're doing here, folks. They couldn't just pass a law saying, well, Black men can't vote because the 15th Amendment barred that. But they put into effect all these other things, poll taxes, literacy, understanding clauses, putting the right to vote in the hands of local registrars, all that. And it eliminated almost all Black voting. Well, when the Supreme Court got to look at this, and also in other cases, Alabama, et cetera, they said, well, look, this law doesn't say anything about race. We can't go into the motives of the legislators, so we just go by the text. This is a textual, Williams v. Mississippi, Giles v. Harris. These are textualist decisions, which said it's fine if they take the right to vote away from Blacks, as long as they don't mention the word race. This shows you where the just erasing history, erasing context, it can lead you down very, very pernicious roads. And unfortunately, that is the self-proclaimed mode of interpreting the law that Judge Barrett has been promoting and apparently will bring onto the Supreme Court. So what we need, I'm not, if we get a new administration, et cetera, the first thing I would like to see done is a national law establishing the right to vote. for all citizens 18 years old and over, overriding all these local voter suppression efforts. Would the current Supreme Court uphold such a law? I don't know, but I think they have to be forced to confront it. And this would, put us in the same league as many other modern countries where everybody, adult, has the right to vote, and there's no question about that. We have not yet reached that level.
Lee, if I may, just one. Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add a footnote that I use this for my students when they say, well, how could voter suppression work? Explain it. And I said, well, let's just pick Louisiana, which I'd mentioned earlier was a majority black state. In 1898, there were 130,000 black men registered to vote in Louisiana. After their state constitutional convention, that number had been reduced precisely to 1,342 by 1904. That's incredible. In 6 years, that's what happened. And as Eric and Kim have said, we can't let that happen again. And people are trying to do that to us all over again in unscrupulous and devious ways.
Yep. So changing the laws with respect to voting, one very, very important idea to have on the table. Skip, nobody in the United States certainly has bridged the scholarly world with the public discussion world better than you have. And I know you're very to art and popular culture and how it interplays with all of this. There's a temptation that Kim and I at least have to go to law questions. Let's start with art questions. How would you analyze the current state of public life in terms of artistic, film, pictorial, pamphlets, everything that goes into the creation of a public mind?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, thank you for the compliment. I have a PhD in English literature. I didn't go to film school, but I've been working hard and studying and trying to get better with each film. And it's a lot of fun. And I take on topics, a bit like going to graduate school. I take on topics that I want to learn about, like Reconstruction. And our next series will be on the history of Black social networks. What happened when the curtain of racism, curtain of Jim Crow came crashing down? Did Black people just capitulate? No, they replicated the white world from which they had been excluded. And actually it started with the Prince Hall Masons and the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the 18th century. And it goes all the way to Black Twitter and Black Lives Matter. But it's a time, because of the internet, because of streaming, because of the revolution in media and social media, of tremendous explosion of output and choice, which is both good and bad. It's also a time of tremendous explosion of racist hate speech that is disgusting. But we have more people of color, more women, not only producing art and various forms of media, but also in executive positions, controlling them, as it were, the means of production. We don't have enough by far, but compared to 10 years ago, the increase in Black and female and gay and trans, et cetera, decision makers has increased exponentially. And I find that enormously exciting. The other change too, if you look at the major foundations, look at the Ford Foundation, who's headed by Darren Walker, who's a man publicly gay and African-American. The Mellon Foundation by the brilliant Elizabeth Alexander, with a PhD in African-American studies. They've redefined the mission of their foundations around social justice. Nobody would have dreamed that the Mellon Foundation would do that. Even 5 years ago, do you know that? Or the Ford Foundation, my God. So that there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of
things, we're in a dynamic situation.
Mm-hmm.
That's one reason this outcome, I mean, there are 1,000 reasons that November 3rd is the most important election of our time and maybe in our history. But the future of diversity, openness, interracial colloquy, interracial democracy, all of that depends, a lot of that depends on what happens on November 3rd, which is why I'm just, you know, when I wake up, I think, why do I have anxiety? You go, oh yeah, a little virus is attacking the planet and killing people, and we can't see and we can't fix it. And Donald Trump's the president of the United States, and he could be reelected. And I go, oh yeah, that's why I have anxiety. It is, I just want everybody to vote. I'm doing all I can to get people to vote, because I think the future of our democracy and our public culture is at stake, and that's an understatement.
I share that view, Skip. Kim, if you look at sort of the development of First Amendment doctrine, free speech, and in the 1950s and 60s is when the modern conceptions of free speech, free press were developed. And the Supreme Court went all in on extraordinary protections for speech, including hate speech and group libel and so on. And there's been a standard analysis of this, which I think is accurate, that the development of that strong First Amendment doctrine was related to trying to protect civil rights movement. It was, Harry Calvin said, the African American who really changed the First Amendment doctrine that we live with today. Mm-hmm. But today, we're hearing increasingly that social media platforms, the internet, et cetera, has made hate speech and racist speech so potent, so pernicious in the society that maybe we need to reconsider that. Mm-hmm. What do you feel about this in the years ahead? How should this be thought about?
So I want all the listeners to know that this is like Einstein asking someone to talk about the theory of relativity. I am talking to the expert on free speech. But I'll accept the invitation to say a couple of things about perhaps what we're learning now to make us at least rethink some of the foundations for what we think the role of speech is and how it best allows us to debate and come to a social understanding truths. Part of the idea was that the best way to contend with competing ideas about society is just to have it out, to be able to engage in the free exchange of ideas, as it were. The truth comes from examining and exploring competing claims, right? That's sort of what everybody's kind of 101 sense of it is. Well, let's start with what's happening now that makes us worry about it. What's happening now is we don't even have the performance of that happening, right? We have, I don't even like to use the word increasing polarization. We have two, sort of different publics engaging in different assertions. The idea that the assertion should have anything to do with reality is no longer holding us to any kind of accountability. You can just as easily, say a lie from the White House as you can, say that the world is flat. There seem to be relatively no repercussions from it, and that causes it's at least a moment where we have to think about, well, what did we think was going to happen? I mean, where did we think that there were going to be some consequences to just bald-faced, lying as part of the process of political engagement? We're just looking around like, well, this is unscripted. And to that, I want to say, to think that is to not really know the history of Reconstruction. To think that we're in a new place where facts have no meaning, where people can say anything, where what people believe is more important than what is. That's not new. That's what happened to Reconstruction. So bald-faced lies about Black people, bald-faced lies about Reconstruction governments, bald-faced lies about the ability of Black folks to reach across the racial aisle and come to agreement with white folks. All of these things were lied about, and that lie has become part of lost cause understandings of Reconstruction that made its way all the way to the White House, not just recently, but way back when Wilson actually sat and screened Birth of a Nation. Here are bald-faced lies about our history that, guess what, aren't just about opposing opinions. These lies actually became the grounding for actual disenfranchisement, segregating, you know, the federal the federal government, for increased racial violence. So what we've inherited in the 20th century is the product of the failure of this idea of the free exchange. So now here we are again. And I think the question for all of us is, what do we do about the fact that the models haven't really seemed to work out? And let me add this for the last kicker. Not only are the models not working, but the repression is coming against those of us who are engaging in anti-racism. So basically, we are now under a gag order if the president gets his way. Where's the free speech, you know, advocates now?
I think I'm being called to open this up, but Skip and Eric. Eric first, anything more you want to add on this?
I think that was a very cogent discussion that Kim gave us. Yeah, I have one other little plan I want to see implemented, which is to enforce the second section of the 14th Amendment, which provided that states that deny people the right to vote, men back then only, but then with the women's suffrage amendment, anybody, states that deny anybody the right to vote will lose members of Congress in proportion. And there are states now that, if you count it up, have denied so many people the right to vote that they should lose one or two members of Congress, their representation. That might actually shake people up a little bit in these states that are trying to limit the right to vote. It's never been enforced. It's supposed to be automatic. It says shall lose, not may or something. They shall lose this representation. I have formed a little club. It now has 2 members, me and Professor Gabriel Chin, a law professor out in California, to enforce the second section of the 14th Amendment. And anyone else who wants to try to do that is welcome to join our club.
I'm happy to join.
I'll send you a certificate of membership. Okay.
Skip, the final word.
Yes, both Kimberly and Eric are talking about the narrative. When we talk about free speech, what's implied is control of the means of production. Not only who can write a narrative, but who can distribute the narrative, who can tell the tale, who gets to write the history. As far as I'm concerned, our country's first social media war was the Lost Cause campaign that attempted to erase anything good that Black people had done in Reconstruction. You know, I always make my students watch Birth of a Nation, which is agonizing, but I make them watch it because they would never watch it, and they watch it in class. It's over 3 hours long. People think of the Birth of a Nation as being about the Civil War. It is not. It is about Reconstruction, and they are parroting, particularly the South Carolina legislature, which, as I indicated, in 1868 was majority Black. But my favorite character in this social media war in the 1890s was the historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Her name was Mildred Lewis Rutherford, and no one who believes in free speech should forever get her name. She published a book called The Measuring Rod. And again, I made my graduate students last semester read this book, and it was distributed widely to librarians and teachers of history in the 1890s. And I just want to quote three things that she said. It was meant to influence whether a librarian brought a book about the Civil War or Reconstruction, or a teacher taught using a book about the Civil War Reconstruction. Quote, reject a book that says the South fought the Civil War to hold her slaves. Reject a book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust. Reject a book that glorifies Abraham Lincoln. This is a direct quote from this book. Her common core was the lost cause, and that same effort was coterminous with the construction of so many of the Confederate monuments that we see today. They were geniuses at stifling free speech and controlling public discourse. Geniuses. You have to be astonished at the efficacy with which they wiped out the narrative of positivity or success of interracial democracy or Black rights during that painfully short period following the Civil War. So effective that by the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, these people, in the mock charges, the former Confederates and the former members of the Union, they embraced each other. They threw down their bayonets, embraced each other and cried, looked at each other like, why did we lose 750,000 people over these Negroes? What could we have been thinking? So much for the second founding, so much for the new birth of freedom. That's astonishing to me. How our country fought a civil war, and Lee surrenders to Appomattox, Lee surrenders to Grant and Appomattox in April 1865, and the Supreme Court enshrines separate but equal as the law of the land, American apartheid, 31 years later. That is mind-boggling to me, and we can't let that happen again.
And let's just recognize that that's partly what's at stake in the executive order that wants to gag conversation at the federal level about structural racism, about implicit bias, about white supremacy, white privilege, critical race theory, intersectionality. That is taking a page out of the book of lost cause projects and placing it right in the middle of this contemporary moment. If we don't see that connection, then we may be looking at a very similar kind of future, the same that you've just pointed out, Skip.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you
Amen.
to all of you. And I turn this over to Anne.
Thank you all. We have some questions from our audience this evening, including questions from folks who've identified as Columbia students. So thank you for accepting their questions here. One is, how does the contemporary persistence of extra-legal and police violence against African Americans reflect the legacies of Reconstruction?
Let me say a word about that.
Sure.
The 14th Amendment, among other things, says that no state can deprive any person of the equal protection of the law. And the people who wrote that meant protection both kind of metaphorically, but also actually physically, because these things were being debated. There were riots in Memphis and New Orleans, really massacres of Black people in the streets, led by the police in those cities in 1866, which helped to frame the debate in Congress about the 14th Amendment. There had been the New York City draft riots during the Civil War, where police took part in victimizing Black citizens in New York City. So the issue of the police treating African Americans in a certain way goes way back to the early Reconstruction era, and of course before. But these measures were meant to try to force a more equitable kind of policing on the South. And during Reconstruction, Skip mentioned, Black members of the legislatures, of Congress, etc. They were also, for the first time, and this was pretty shocking to a lot of white people, Black policemen on the streets of southern cities. And that was another thing that led to a considerable backlash. So the point is, yes, that issue has been with us certainly since Reconstruction, how the forces of authority physically deal with African Americans on the streets of our country.
Precisely. White supremacy arose simultaneously. There was always anti-Black racism, but white supremacy, as we know it per se, arose during Reconstruction. I remind my students that the 13th Amendment, was ratified in December of 1865. When was the Ku Klux Klan born? At the end of 1865. And as you say, Eric, between 1866 and 1876, there were at least 8 major massacres. And these are massacres of Black people by a variety of white supremacist groups. There wasn't, when we talk about 12 years of Black freedom, in my formulation, followed by an alt-right rollback, the alt-right rollback was accompanied the rise of these Black rights. It didn't just materialize in 1876, rape, terrorism, lynching, but 3,724 lynchings from 1889 to 1930, 80% of them Black. It was, white supremacy was like a volcano, rose like a volcano in reaction to these new, the expression of Black people expressing their newfound rights. And it was devastatingly effective.
I guess I'll just throw I was looking for a moment to say this, and Skip, thank you for that. I just want to, I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about gender and Reconstruction, and the racial terrorism and the failure to protect speaks with a special resonance with respect to what was happening with Black women in these riots, as they were called. The widespread sexual abuse of Black women was, Black women testified about it. It was known that this was a dimension of the redemption. And yet in our historical memory of it, it's one of the things that's least likely to be discussed. When we talk about racial violence and we talk about sexual abuse, most of the time we default to thinking about African-American men falsely accused of sexual abuse, and not the predicate. The predicate was widespread sexual abuse of Black women that then got projected upon Black men as a consequence, of tyranny. Well, partly because the truth of the matter was it was a consequence of white racial tyranny. And so the consequence of that is more or less a double erasure, of the fact that, first of all, this was happening to Black women, and second, our ability to talk about that and the contemporary legacy of that isn't as robust in our understanding of anti-Black racism. One of the best resources that has shaped my thinking about this is Crystal Femster's book on Southern horrors, Women in the Politics of Race and Lynching. So Say Her Name is a way of also lifting that up and looking back and seeing the ways that the treatment of Black women has been part of anti-Black racism, part of redemption. But at this point in our recovery of Reconstruction, we have to do a double recovery of it. Reconstruction and recovering those elements of Reconstruction that wrote the story of Black women at that time period.
Thank you. Here's another question from our audience. How will knowing this history help our country overcome racial injustice, and who will have to do what?
Well, for me, I want this story, excuse me, to be part of the curriculum. From, you know, we need a revolution in the way that we teach the history of race and gender in this country. The curriculum needs to be dramatically changed. Not only Reconstruction, but the whole thing. I mean, look at the astonishing amount of ink. I don't know that, Lee, is that the right metaphor anymore? I mean, what is the metaphor that has been spilled?
Ink works,
you know,
works for me.
On the 1619 Project. People will write about this 20, 30 years from now. It will be seen to be a metaphor for larger forces. We're so much in it that we can't see the full set of resonances that 1619 has set off. But the one thing I know that we need is to change the narrative of American history to account for genocide. You know, people use original sin. The original sin to me was the genocide of the indigenous people who lived here. But if we look at, we were talking in our waiting room about DNA and genealogy and genetics. The average African American is 24% European. The average, I'm going to repeat that. The average African American is 24% European. Now, where did that 24% European come from? It came primarily from rape, or at best cajoled sexuality in a mismatched power relationship. I mean, the living proof of what Kimberly Crenshaw just said is in our genomes, in the admixture of the African American people. And it's irrefutable.
Professor Crenshaw, you want to add?
Yeah, well, I'll just, on that point, I'll just give people some numbers. In 1790, there were approximately 700,000 or so African slaves. The importation of slaves ended in 1808. At the dawn of the Civil War, there were about 4 million. Where did they come from? How did this happen? We're talking about the industrialization of rape, of forced reproduction. What has been the reckoning with that, right? Reconstruction was partially a reckoning to the extent that it allowed families to come back together. But the assault on Black womanhood, the assault on their autonomy, the assault on their character, that's still very much part of what is part of the way that Black women are received and perceived. We can see it even in the way that our vice presidential candidate is being talked about. So again, thinking about what is the unfinished business is what we hope will come from the recovery. We'll be able to read what's happening now as a product of the past. I think that the two other things that stand out for me is the deep dangers of status loss, status threats, how deep and abiding that desire is to act out one's insecurity, one's dominance through the ritual of lynching, through the ritual of obliterating a group of people that have been seen as the source of all that ails us. So what's so dangerous about this moment, win or loss, frankly, in November, is that this sentiment has been unleashed again. It's been legitimized again, along with all of the others, along with the official other, who can be seen as legitimate targets of antipathy and violence. I think I'm just sometimes surprised at how close to the edge we seem to be, and folks don't really seem to see it. And the last thing is, you know, along with what's most important is what people think, then rather than what the actual reality is that ideas and narratives can be more powerful than guns and cannons. That is what the story that Skip just told us about the lost cause. That's why who controls the narrative is so fundamentally important. That's why when you see an attack on the 1619 Project and you see an attack on the ability to even analyze why we have so much disparity in COVID, the actual material inequality and the ability to talk about those things are one and the same. If we attack one, we've lost the other. So we are at that precipice, I think, in this moment. I often wonder how Black people felt in 73, 75. Did they see what was coming? Did they have any idea that the likelihood that things would get significantly worse rather than better was just around the corner? And if they had known, what would they have done? This is the question that I think our society should be asking now. We know what's possible. Now that we know what's possible, how does that put us in the position to throw everything we've got at this moment? And like you, Skip, I wake up every morning and remember that I'm deeply stressed. I'm so hopeful that everybody sees this moment in the way that we do, and we can live to fight another day.
Could I give an example of where I think a discussion like this should have impact on very major policy and constitutional interpretation issues? So in the arena of affirmative action, when that has gone to the Supreme Court, the earliest case on this was the Bakke case. And in that case, Justice Powell, Lewis Powell, at the time wrote the really important opinion. And in that he said, colleges and universities can take race into account for purposes of achieving educational diversity. Not defined, very vague, but not if the colleges and universities did this in order to correct for past discrimination in the society. So it was explicitly said in the constitutional interpretation that if you at all try to justify taking race into account in building your student body, because of the history of the country and the existence of extreme racism and invidious discrimination, if you did that, it was unconstitutional. Now, to my mind, that is a form of erasure built into constitutional doctrine. Complicated issue, there are other ways to see it, but that to me is an example of where the society has taken a major question and framed it not in terms of a historical past, but in terms of a vague set of values that really cloud what it is that is really happening.
Well put.
Professor Foner, anything to add?
I agree. Let's hear another question.
All right. So what one action could help resolve the outstanding issues of Reconstruction?
What one thing?
There's no one action that can do that. The outstanding issues, as Skip said at the very beginning, the issues of Reconstruction are still with us. Who should be a citizen? Who should have the right to vote? How do you deal with economic inequalities? How do you deal with terrorism? Terrorism was a feature of Reconstruction, and it's still out here. And in fact, domestic terrorism is a growing problem in this country, as we know. I don't think there's, to me, if there's one thing though, and this goes back to a little bit what Kim was saying, it's the first step is to recognize the problem. If we do not directly face the problem of inequality, of racial inequality, and indeed other kinds of inequality, and then they can never be addressed. So and that comes from above as well as from below. We need leadership that is willing to candidly say, we have a serious problem in this country. It has deep historical roots. Let us figure out how to address it. That statement is as important as a law or a Supreme Court decision, something that changes, as we've said, the discourse to actually stimulate people to think of what should be the concrete actions that are taken to address our problems.
I would like to see focus put on the revolution in our public education. Now, I mean, everybody talks about we have to make our schools better. But what if we, and maybe this is a stupid idea, I don't know, but why should, I live in Harvard Square. I'm in my kitchen, right? And the amount of money spent per child in Cambridge or in Latin has to be much higher than it is but back home in Piedmont, West Virginia, where I went to high school, right? How come that can't be nationalized so that the amount of money spent per child is the same? Whether you're in Princeton High School, Palo Alto, whatever fancy, rich neighborhood public school that you have access to. Would that make a difference? Have we ever tried it? People poo-poo it and say it wouldn't. Let's try it and see. I think my focus is on changing the narrative, because that's what, God put me on the earth to be a professor and to tell the story of my people. I believe that, and that's what I'm trying to do as best that I can. But why don't we try to change the reverence that we had for public schools? Do you know that my father lived to be 97 and a half. My mom died, unfortunately, when she was 70. But they went to their graves. They never spoke of even a teacher who had passed in their school years, or mine or my brother's, by their first name. Now, this might sound corny to the students out there, but that just shows the respect. It was Miss Smith, Mr. McHenry, Mr. Jones, Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Garfield. That the teachers had an enormous amount of respect in the community, even though they weren't paid a lot of money. And that was a noble calling. We didn't, what was an infraction when I was in school? I'm 70 years old, so let me be upfront about it. Chewing gum, putting gum under the desk. We never would have talked back to a teacher, never in a million years. So what happened for that level of respect and the hope and promise of the public school system to disintegrate? And then how do we begin to get it back? Well, I think with financial means, with economic resources would be one. I would like to see it tried. Maybe it wouldn't work, but who knows?
I'm going to resist the question, because of course there's not going to be one thing, but I will say one thing. I think that for those of us who are concerned about how to make progress, how to resist this backward momentum, we have done a terrible job at telling the story about the Supreme Court. Those who are appalled by what has happened, who are deeply concerned about the direction of our country, are generally not those who really focus as much as I think they should on judicial appointments. I think the research from the 2016 election showed that Trump voters listed the courts as number one on their priorities. Clinton voters, it was like number 4. How can this be? How can this be if we know this history, if we understand how the courts have, for longer period been not friends to social justice than the short periods in which they have been. And how can this be recognizing one of the reasons we don't have campaign finance reform, one of the reasons why we don't have a right to education, one of the reasons we don't have a universal right to vote, has been largely due to the decisions of our Supreme Court. So I'll throw in, I know in the end we plug something. We did a webinar called Under the Black Light. It is Why the Court Matters, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy and the fight she leaves behind. I encourage anyone who is wondering about why we focus on the court, why it's so important, just to listen to it and think about this. Today, Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in my opinion, probably would not have been nominated. What is that telling us about the state of judicial politics and in turn the state of our democracy?
President Bollinger, anything to?
Well, this is an incredibly important area, and Kim is completely right about this. I think it's, from my point of view, there was a kind of tragic turn of events that happened after the 1960s and 70s. And that's when people who really were part of the civil rights era and the Warren Court movements and all that came from that, some turned away. And the conservative wings of American society focused, and they focused in a really, really concentrated way. And the Federalist Society was the manifestation of that. And what we've seen is several decades of that focus coming to fruition with a federal judiciary that is fundamentally different from the judiciary that existed at the time of the Warren Court and into the 1970s and even the 80s. So I think from my point of view, what I would say, Kim is right. And we are paying the consequences of not having paid sufficient attention to the Supreme Court and the federal courts and the state courts and the roles that they play in developing the values of the society. So I think it's a really important lesson to learn and one to correct.
Let me just add one other thing. Not being a law professor, it may be easier for me to say this. Even the Warren Court dropped the ball in many ways. They refused to directly confront the long history of, to my mind, erroneous decisions of the Supreme Court, going back to the 1870s, and some that Kim mentioned before. They worked around them. They didn't want to do, they were not willing to say, hey, we have been wrong here for about 70 years, and now we're going to try to get it right. So as President Bollinger pointed out, when it came to affirmative action, the only way it's justifiable is through so-called diversity, with history eliminated. Diversity is something for whites. In other words, the argument is, well, putting a few black people in your classroom makes the education of white people. Fair enough, but that's not why you have affirmative action. And then even the, the civil rights law of 1964, when it was upheld, was not on the basis that the discrimination by hotels and restaurants and other businesses is just a degrading violation of the rights of citizenship and should be barred under the 14th Amendment. No, they said this impedes the free flow of commerce. Discrimination against blacks. People weren't in the streets in Birmingham facing Bull Connor's dogs in order to facilitate the flow of goods across the line, But that's what the Supreme Court said. They were unwilling to break with the old traditions of I think, erroneous jurisprudence. So we need a new Supreme Court, but we need one that will directly confront the long history of, I think, pernicious decisions and say, we're going to start again with the jurisprudence on race in this country.
So just to make this point, and there's still lots of Eric's point about the court was hardly perfect, but taking Skip's idea of equal funding of school districts across the country, in about 1974, 75, I forget the exact year, the Supreme Court, by a vote of 5-4, refused to hold, under the 14th Amendment, that funding public schools by property tax systems was not inherently unequal under the clause. 5-4. If that decision had come out differently, imagine what the world would look like if no state could rely on property tax system for funding public schools. I mean, that's a significant decision that went in a way that preserved the status quo.
Big time. Yeah, thanks for giving us that example. Because I didn't know about that case and that vote. But that is, gee whiz. I mean, it makes me shudder just to think how different things would have been or could have been. You know, Lee, it seems like every time we get close to realizing the principles, the ideals of freedom on which this country was so nobly founded, right? It gets snatched away. As Kim said, when did Black people, Eric and I have talked about this, when did Black people during Reconstruction go, you know, I'm worried? Then they go, you know, I'm really worried. And then when did they realize it was over? I wrote a little piece for the New York Review, which will be out next week, about this very thing. Certainly, the overturning of the civil rights cases in 1883. I think it was this month, wasn't it? And wasn't it October 1883, if I'm remembering correctly? By that time, everybody knew it was over. The Black leaders met at a church in Washington. Everybody was on the stage, and I call it the funeral for Reconstruction. I mean, Reconstruction limped on a little bit longer, but when you got rid of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was Charles Sumner's last dream, Sumner died in 1874, I think. It was passed in 1875. The court says it's unconstitutional in 1883. By that time, everybody had to know that Reconstruction was over. And I wonder about our moment. You know, if Trump wins with this conservative court, look, that court's got a lot to apologize for, as you three have said. Slaughterhouse, Cruikshank, the civil rights case of 1883, Plessy v. Ferguson. You know, we always point to Brown. Thank God. I was 4 years old when Brown schools integrated in Mineral County, West Virginia, if you could believe it, in 1955. So I started in the white school in 1956. I went to Yale in 69, one of 96 Black men and women to enter Yale. And the class of 66 had 6. So I definitely am a product of affirmative action, and I'm very proud of that. But it's not enough. You know, it was not enough just to let us in. In fact, you know who sits in my classroom? When I look at people of color, they're often the children of my classmates and my metaphorical classmates, the children of those of us who integrated the power elite, starting with integrating schools like Columbia, Harvard, Yale, et cetera, and the children of recent African immigrants. And certainly at Harvard, I don't have the figures because nobody will release them, but I believe that a majority of our undergraduates are the children of people who migrated from Africa willingly between 1990 and 2000. More Africans migrated willingly between 1990 and 2000 than came directly in the whole history of the slave trade. So that we have what's happening with race and class. It's something I was so pleased when I saw that the Oxford English Dictionary added the word intersectionality. Kim, you're the only person I know who's contributed a word to the Oxford English Dictionary.
Well, the president is about to send an executive order to take it out.
I know.
If he thinks he can, he's definitely going to try. Someone's got to tell him, you don't have control over Webster.
I'll fight for you. I'll fight for you. You know that.
So there's a final question from one of our audience members about how to keep the current momentum alive and how you all stay hopeful, picking up from the hope that Professor Crenshaw expressed earlier. Some final words on how you stay hopeful in this moment.
Well, I will say this, because we've been talking, so much about the past and sort of wondering, what our ancestors were thinking around, the time just before the cliff, and I'm sure that it was hard to really imagine, not just the fact that when it was over, it was going to be over for generations, but hard to imagine that the end of Reconstruction was not enough, for the race nationalists, that even when all legal hope was over, there was still that taste, still that bloodlust, so that the 90s was more violent than the 80s. Hard to imagine what that is about. So when I think about where to get hope from, even of people that went through that, even of people who had every reason to fully repudiate this entire framework, still were hopeful that the promises would be made good. Now, there are those who want to say that this constant yearning is un-American. I want to say that the yearning is as American as it possibly can be. How much more American can it be to consistently look to a document and to institutions that had consistently disappointed a people, to think that hope springs eternal, to think that even though we see segregation building all around us, even though we see a Congress who's not willing to even pass an anti-lynching law, even though we see a society that sends us off not to one war, but 2 wars and lynches us when we come home. What do we make of a people who still are willing to embrace the story, the narrative, in hope that there is, at the end of the day, a happy ending? So when I wake up and think, oh my God, what is happening? I also think, well, there have been ancestors who woke up and there was less on the table for them to work with than there is for us to work with now. So that for me creates what the imperative is now. We have the resources, we have the understanding, we have the history, we know how this can unravel. So the challenge for us is to act like we know it. And that to me is both the possibility and the frustration of the moment.
Beautifully put. I want to applaud. Can I clap?
Absolutely. Professor Foner, Professor Gates, anything?
My motto is always that of Antonio Gramsci: optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect. Pessimism of the intellect means you got to candidly confront the situation you're living in. But if you don't have optimism of the will, then you're not going to be motivated to actually try to change things. And I do think that we do need to remember, even though we've been talking about sort of the aftermath of Reconstruction, not everything that was accomplished in Reconstruction was wiped away, even at the depths of the Jim Crow system. As Kim mentioned before, Black families were consolidated during Reconstruction who had been separated under slavery, and the Black family now was able to be a strong key element, of course, in Black communities. The Black church became the giant independent institution that it is today during Reconstruction. Public education for African Americans, which had barely existed anywhere before the Civil War, suddenly came into existence. Public schools, Black colleges, etc. And these institutions, and they survived, they weren't wiped away. The family, the church, the school, these were the springboards of later struggles to implement the Reconstruction vision of a country that had somehow gone beyond the tyranny of race. So if people, as Kim said, if people back then could keep struggling in the face of really daunting odds, we should be willing to do the same thing.
Thank you. Professor Gates?
All I can say is amen to what the sister and the brother said. When Kim said that reminded us that the slave trade ends January 1st, 1808. Think about our ancestors in slavery. They had no idea that there was going to be a civil war. I mean, what sane person thought in 1808 that there was going to be a civil war that was going to end slavery? There was no hope, no end in sight for the institution of slavery. But what did African Americans do? They made a way out of no way. And that's one of the favorite expressions of our people. They made families as best they could. People fell in love and out of love. I mean, they suffered a tremendous amount of violence, and they were in a world defined by violence. But they also worshiped God. They refashioned the image of God in their own images. They created one of the world's great musics, and sacred and secular. Some of the world's great dances. Black people, when they had no hope, no light on the horizon at all, only a crazy person would have thought that slavery was going to end, they made a culture. In all that darkness, they made a culture, and it's one of the world's greatest, it is one of the greatest contributions of any people to world civilization. That is the miracle of the Black experience for me. That is the miracle of our ancestors' enslavement. And I take hope from that. I take hope from that.
President Bollinger?
So I'm a little older than Skip, a little younger than Eric, a lot of Kim. So I was shaped by Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, when I went to college, went to law school, when I thought about what I would do as a scholar, professor, my universe was absolutely shaped by Brown. I mean, there was no subject you could take up that was not within the penumbra of that decision. And there was a fairly clear enemy. There was something there, and it illuminated the time, and it made it incredibly important and exciting. For students who are living now, I think there is something like this happening. I think it's more of an illuminating moment than was true 20 years ago, let's say, or 30 years ago. And I think that's wonderful for young people. And what I would say is there will be ways in which that illumination, that knowledge, that understanding will really empower you. When I was sued by the group challenging affirmative action, and they sued me personally and the university, I didn't ask for that. And that was not something that I said, gee, I'm going to take this issue up. But for the next 6 years of my life, it consumed me because of the way in which I was shaped in the 1960s and 70s. And that something like that will happen to, I think, each of you. And that is, that's important. And there'll be moments when you can contribute, and you got to be ready to take advantage of that. It's a great feeling, actually, to be with these colleagues here and to listen to them and all the reflections and the depth of knowledge, understanding they bring to this. And so it's a wonderful and that you and others have put on. I want to say thank you to everyone who's done this.
Thank you, President.
Thank you.
Bolger. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President.
And thank you also to our panelists, Professor Crenshaw, Professor Foner, Professor Gates, for this very informative program this evening. And tonight's discussion provides a fitting backdrop for exciting news that I want to share very briefly regarding a partnership between Columbia Libraries and the Department of History, which is the Lehman Center for American History. It was founded decades ago, established in honor of the late New York Governor and U.S. Senator Herbert H. Lehman, whose record of public service was exceptional. And Lehman's personal papers are cared for by Columbia's libraries alongside extensive archives related to many aspects of U.S. history. The Department of History and Columbia Libraries are relaunching the Lehman Center this year with a new vision to help inform civic engagement and social responsibility by examining the histories that frame urgent issues today. And the Lehman Center is focusing on publicly accessible programs delivered these days virtually and featuring faculty speakers from history and numerous other disciplines, as well as outside experts whose perspectives add vital input and new insights to complex challenges. And these include such topics as race, health, and inequality, American politics and identities, and a series that will probe the history of policing, race, and resistance. And as with all of our public programs, we welcome Columbia students and a broad audience of viewers. More details on these programs will be forthcoming in a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this evening's event. So in closing, I just want to thank again our outstanding panelists and President Bollinger for moderating, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. Please be well and stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.